So welcome back to our last panel in our conference on the Corona economic shock. The last panel is called On Crisis Moments and Paradigm Shifts, How to Make Us More Resilient. And it brings us to a more overarching question that will pick up on elements of the discussion of the last 2 days, today and yesterday. Look on it from a broader angle. I'm Gerhard Schick. I have the German financial markets non-governmental organization Finanzwende or Finanzwatch Germany. And I'm happy to guide us through this panel. I hope everybody can hear as well, and we have a good concluding panel here. The question of the paradigm shift reminds me of my time in German Parliament in 2008, when during the financial crisis, I heard a speech by then Finance Minister Per Steinbrück criticizing deregulated financial markets with tough words in the German Bundestag. And at the same time, he put forward a law proposal deregulating the insurance sector, the life insurers in Germany. And this happened in the same month. And it was the same minister responsible. And I also recall that there were speeches held in the fall of 2008 that sounded so much like a paradigm shift, when heads of businesses in Germany would hold speeches that sounded like attack activists, criticizing the excesses in financial markets. But then, 1.5 years later, that same voices could not be heard again when it came to actually do the work of re-regulation. And so I think the question, are we talking about a real paradigm shift that this crisis might cause? Or is it just a mood, a question of current talk that will fade as soon as the worst of this crisis is over? And I think it's good to differentiate in today's discussion in that panel. Will that paradigm shift be only felt in the health sector, where we talk about more resilience that we need there? Or will it also cover other crisis dimensions like the financial and economic crisis, and ask question about the stability and resilience of our economic system? Will it also include the climate question and the resilience concerning natural disasters, environmental questions? So I'm looking forward very much to this extremely interesting discussion we're awaiting here. And I'm very happy to welcome with you a group of panelists that will make sure that this will be a vivid and very thoughtful discussion. With us are Maja Göpel. She is a political economist and General Secretary of the German Advisory Council on Global Change. She started Scientists for Future in Germany. KATHARINA PISTOR, professor at the Columbia Law School, author of The Code of Capital, working primarily on legal aspects of capitalism. And we will start with inputs by Laurie Laybourn-Langton. He is economist at the Economic Change Unit in London. And Patrick Love, who jumped in for Gabriela Ramos from the OECD. Patrick Love works also at the program New Approaches to Economic Challenges, which held an extremely interesting conference last fall on averting systemic collapse. And these days, I was often reminded of that conference, and I think you were very timely in raising that question indeed. So if you're ready to start, I would say, Patrick Love, would you go ahead with your input?
Can you hear me now? Yeah, good. Thanks very much for the introduction, and apologies from Gabriela for not being able to make it this afternoon. Yes, last September, we did this conference on averting systemic collapse, which you might say was a failure because we didn't manage to avert the systemic collapse we're now living through, but maybe a few months was too short a time scale. What we said at that time was, and I quote from the summary of the conference, a new crisis could emerge suddenly from many different sources and with potentially harmful effects. So one of the concrete steps we took immediately following that was to organize another conference in March, where we invited, for example, Joshua Epstein, who's an epidemiologist from New York University and is now actually one of the people leading New York's policy response and practical response to the coronavirus epidemic there. So we were already thinking about epidemics because at the OECD and maybe in other organizations, we always tend to be prepared for the last crisis. And the last crisis was a financial crisis. So everybody was thinking about that. What's going to cause the next financial crisis? What should our reaction be? What lessons can we learn from the last one? What we and the people we were working with in the new approaches to economic challenges were trying to say essentially was 2008 was probably the last of the old-fashioned crises, a crisis with an identity. It was a financial crisis. The new crisis, the crisis we're seeing today and the crisis we're seeing in the future will start as one type of crisis and very quickly evolve into other types of crises. So a health crisis quickly becomes an economic crisis, a social crisis, a trade crisis, a political crisis, and so on. We can't circumscribe and say we're only dealing with health, we're only dealing with trade, we're only dealing with X, Y, Z. What we are arguing is we need to take a systemic approach because all these things, as we've seen, unfortunately, are extremely interlinked. We're dealing with systemic risks. The threat that individual failures, accidents, disruptions in one sector, one domain, will cascade through to other domains. So what starts as a health crisis rapidly becomes a financial crisis, an economic crisis, and so on, as already said. So we are looking at things systemically, which means what are the characteristics of a system which are most helpful to study to understand what's happened, why it's happened, and could we prevent it from happening again, or if it doesn't, could we respond better? Foremost of those characteristics, and you hear it all over the place just now, is resilience. Resilience is a system characteristic, and so we have been working with various people outside the organization as well as inside the organization to look at what we mean by systems resilience. One of the groups, for example, we're working with is the US Army Corps of Engineers. Their mission, among other things, is to protect civilian populations from natural disasters like flooding and so on. And they've done extensive work on resilience. And one of the big takeaways for us from that is resilience is often a trade-off with efficiency. Now, OECD traditionally has emphasized efficiency. As late as 2019, last year, our review of the Spanish health system, for example, was congratulating Spain for improving the efficiency of their system by cutting the number of hospital beds. And then a couple of months later, we found out that maybe it would have been useful to have that extra capacity, even if it was costly, even if it wasn't efficient in classic terms. Resilience is just as important, and we see in a crisis probably more important in some domains than strict cost effectiveness and efficiency in the classic way which many economists think about it. So what we're trying to say to people is we're living in a world where nothing, nobody, no firm, no individual, no country really is isolated from all the others. We have to look at interconnections. We have to look at non-linearities. We have to look at phase changes, tipping points, all these aspects of systems, because otherwise we're going to have the usual reaction. And I've noticed a few people have pointed this out already. A crisis happens and we start at the end point and we throw lots of money at it because we think that somehow we're going to get the system back to what it was before. We can't. There is, in the kind of complex system we are talking about, no equilibrium to return to. New normals are normal. We always have to deal with a new situation. So we have to adapt. We have to realize we're in complex adaptive systems which are changed by our actions and change our actions at the same time. That, for an organization like the OECD, is a difficult concept to grasp. We're slowly beginning to change. We're slowly beginning to convince people that what we have to look at is the resilience, the ability of a system to plan and prepare for, absorb and withstand, recover from and adapt to adverse events and disruptions. These disruptions, they can be sudden one-off events like the epidemic, a shock if you like. They may be slow or might be imperceptible for the time being, stresses in engineering terms. And maybe we should look to the engineers rather than to the economists to try and understand some of the basic concepts of systems. Because another lesson we learned was that economists don't have all the answers. So when we're looking at complex systems, we've consulted structural engineers, we've consulted physicists, we've consulted a whole range of people. And another big message after resilience and efficiency often involve a trade-off concerns optimization. The physicists tell us for this the kind of systems they look at, engineers tell us this as well. When you try to optimize one part of a complex system, generally you destabilize the system as a whole. So you have to think holistically. You have to think about the whole system. And I think there are signs in the OECD and in the governments we're talking to that people are beginning to think like this. They are, Laurie will talk more about this after me, I imagine. They are questioning the paradigm. Of course, the immediate reaction is classic for lots of people. We have to improve incentives, we have to solve market failures and so on. But when somebody like Emmanuel Macron, the French president, comes out and says that it's to leave some things to markets, he, who was one of the most fervent deregulators and market apostles until then, it's significant. We still have to see whether there will be a lasting impact on economic policy and economic behavior, or whether it's just the crisis opens people's eyes and then after the crisis, those eyes will close again, as we've seen so many times. So to sum up, I think we have to say we need a systems approach to systemic problems. We need a systems approach to systemic crisis. And that means looking at things which we certainly haven't considered much until now, like resilience, like asymmetries, a small effect can have a big impact, like non-linearities, tipping points, phase changes, and so on. And we shouldn't say we haven't been warned. We have been. We've been warned constantly that this kind of thing can happen. I'll just finish with an anecdote from a previous conference we organized to mark 10 years of, since the economic crisis, the fall of Lehman Brothers. We asked the chief economist of Lehman, what happened? What was it like inside Lehman at that time? And he told us something very interesting. They had a model which they called Damocles, which was essentially to look at emerging economies and look at the chance of some kind of major shock or financial crisis happening to see whether they should invest or not. And more or less for fun, they ran this model using United States data. The model came out with a prediction that in the following year, there was something like a 70% chance of a major financial crisis in the United States. So they thought, well, there must be something wrong with the paradigms, the data. They reran it, got the same answer. So the chief economist goes to see the CEO and the other people and said, look, we can't go on like this. We're heading for the wall. They panic, slightly. And then they ask him to check. He checks and checks and checks. And they said, right, so, okay, this is really worrying what you're telling us. So when do you think it's all going to come tumbling down? He said, well, I can't tell you that. I can tell you it's going to happen. I can't give you a date. They said to him, well, you can give us a date. Come back and tell us, because in the meantime, we're making money and we're protecting market share, and we're not going to stop doing either. He tells this story in December 2007 at the annual Christmas dinner of chief economists of Lehman's and other big institutions. And it turns out they all had the same conversation with their boards. You think something terrible is going to happen, we have to change. But they didn't. And so we asked them, so what's changed in the 10 years since then? He said, not much. We see the same thing. The experts are giving warnings. The people who can take decisions to avoid the catastrophe are not making those decisions. He said, but one thing, he said, I was talking about the financial system. Now we're seeing that about the climate system and a whole series of other systems. So the warnings are there. The systems are fragile. The systems are interconnected. There must be some response that's better than trying to pay for the catastrophe after it's happened. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The anecdote is at first sight funny, but then frightening, isn't it? I pass on directly without further comments from my side to Laurie. Please go ahead with your input.
Thank you very much, Gerhard, and Patrick as well. I'm going to share my screen with some slides, if that's okay with everyone. I'll do that now. I'm assuming everyone can see those okay. I had been asked to do a paper by the forum before this kicked off, looking at how crisis has driven paradigm shift in the past. We weren't anticipating in being asked to do that the crisis would come over the course of me doing that. So the presentation here is a swift effort to try and update some of the work I'd been doing before. I'm going to look at three areas. The kind of classical approach to understanding how ideas shift when it comes to crisis that is often, we find, used as a heuristic in people's minds when it comes to strategies for shifting political economic ideas. We'll then look at specifically whether health crises are a special case, whether they have particular pertinence on shifting the political economic paradigm, and then whether or not crisis is wise to have crisis as a strategy in itself. So do crises drive change? Well, they obviously do. It's a verifiable historical fact that there has been change in the wake of crisis itself. But how do we better understand that? Well, the classical model for this is that if you have crises of significant impact, or what I've called significance here along the horizontal axis, and certain reach, then we will inevitably lead to a situation where change occurs. And I think many people have that in their minds based upon historical instances, like, for example, the aggregate crises across first interwar and then the post-World War II period, leading to the shift toward embedded liberalism or the post-war consensus. There are smaller examples, though, like, for example, the collapse of the outsourcing giant Carillion in the UK a couple of years back. It was a very significant event, but it didn't lead to a shift in the overall political economic paradigm because it didn't necessarily have the reach or the perceived significance to drive a deeper shift in people's thoughts about economic policy. So there clearly is some kind of dividing line whereby you have to flip over this, a certain level of significance and reach of an event, whereby a deeper rethink of economic ideas occur. And I would say that there are a lot of factors that go into that, but taboos are a particularly important one when it comes to a deeper rethink of political economic ideas. Specifically, that in response to those crises, unprecedented actions, often actions that people had been told were impossible or simply undesirable in an extreme way, are then experimented with. And of course, the 2007-2008 crash is one example, as were the crises of the 1970s, which, along with of the interwar and Second World War period captivate at least the Anglo-American perception of the shifts in paradigms that we've seen over the last 100 years. But while the 2007-2008 crash, as I'm sure has been discussed in many of the panels before, was one of these things that did significantly break taboos, it didn't fit into our further delineation here of having constituted a significant paradigm shift, at least overall and at least so far. And there are a number of factors that, of course, go into deciding whether or not we slip here into the top right-hand corner of this graph, including the efforts taken by campaigners, academics, thinkers, politicians, and all others who try to push change in the moment of crisis, as well as the deeper structural situation that those actors find themselves within. I've been, as I'm sure you all have, involved with many conversations over the last few weeks that have tried to compare the current moment to some of these that have pushed a deeper paradigm shift. One of those, of course, is the shift to embedded liberalism after the Second World War. And there are notable comparisons with the situation we find ourselves in today. We are seeing unprecedented state action. There was a growing clamour for change before this crisis emerged. There was a widely shared, intense experience among populations. In the Second World War, they were mobilised to go to war after having experienced the biggest economic crisis in the modern world. And today we have many people who are indoors who are experiencing the public health implications of this. And we have deeper economic and geopolitical implications today, as of course we did back then. Similarly, when it comes to the crises of the 1970s and early 1980s, where we saw the shift toward the neoliberal paradigm, we had arguments linking the failings of the prevailing ideas to the kind of crises like the winter of discontent in the UK that we see in the picture here. We are seeing that now when it comes to certain policies of austerity or efficiency, as Patrick was saying, being linked to the current problems. We also have people saying that the current crisis now shows some of the failures of the state, that state actors are not nimble enough to respond to the current crisis in the way that they were seen as not being able to respond to the crisis of the 1970s. And crucially, today, will the problems that we see be perceived as something deeper? Will they be perceived as something actually inherent within our overall economic system, within capitalism itself, that globalized connectivity and a dependency on the labor market are things that have been part of driving the crisis that we see now? This is some forward planning that we did in one of my organizations at the very beginning of this crisis to try using those historical analogies to look at where we would be heading. So we've got the length of public health restrictions on the horizontal axis here and the scale of economic damage on the vertical. Many people, I think, initially were anticipating or hoping for a global version of the SARS pandemic at the beginning of the 2000s, in which you did see, as we will see in a slide in a minute, quite a quick bounce back, some significant damage, but public health restrictions relaxed reasonably quickly. As time has gone on, it looks like we're heading more towards the upper right-hand quadrant that we've called World War II, where the public health restrictions are enduring, the damage is extraordinary, and therefore deeper structural changes occur in the economy. Many people are now trying to push for the kind of narrative that dominates now, and particularly after the crisis itself. And it's been very interesting to see how some of the sources and some of the people who would usually expect to be advocating for the previous approach are now talking about a need for some kind of change. And often we find that that is happening roughly into three areas. And this is a linear theory of change that will not occur in real life, but that at the moment, we've got arguments about the emergency measures that are being taken, which will have already and will increasingly blur into arguments about recovery. And then from there into arguments about deeper reform. And I couldn't agree more with Patrick about the need for that reform to be focused more on resilience of systems, particularly in the modern world in which there is so much connectivity and in which efficiency has been placed above resilience, often at the expense of resilience. And I think we must also note that this may not immediately be seen as a crisis of the existing paradigm, partly because the nature of the crisis, public health seemingly coming out of nowhere, an exogenous shock, these are phrases that have been used before, people may not put two and two together. But in the past, and that means that we may not get a paradigm shift, and we wouldn't be popping into the top right-hand corner there. But in the past, what have public health crises done? Have they been a special case? Have they actually led people to make those connections that could lead to a shift in the political economic paradigm? Well, the Black Death, the big example, the answer is, well, yes, obviously. I think we're all probably quite aware of the deep and enduring changes that occurred off the back of the Black Death when it came to economic, political, social structures across most of the world, particularly in Europe. What about the early 2000s SARS pandemic? Well, that's a bit more ambiguous. And the answer is probably not. There was an impact upon China at the time that is discernible. You can see that across some of these graphs here. But in the main, the response, where there was a V-shaped recovery, as it were, that recovery was helped by the wider economic situation around the world. But we could say that the experience of China and other countries in Southeast Asia during that crisis led them to have greater levels of preparedness for the current crisis. And therefore, the question of whether the SARS pandemic had a major impact upon political economic ideas may be one that we will discover in the future based upon how various countries react now. And in blunt terms, it could be that the levels of preparedness and the lessons learned by some in Southeast Asia, particularly China, could have a bearing on how they perform in the process of trying to win political economic arguments now. What about the Spanish flu? Probably. Now, at the time, the crisis was extraordinary. Many more people were killed in some cases, depending on the country, than were killed in the First World War. A review by the St. Louis Federal Reserve says that the impact of the pandemic in American society didn't have a permanent effect on what they call collectivity, so institutions and society in the main, but on the atoms of human society, so the individuals, and that we didn't have this enduring wider effect. Now, I don't think that is the case. I think that as part of a general atmosphere of crisis and change, the Spanish flu had a major impact. And we particularly see that when it comes to public health. So the obvious failings of nations to be able to protect their populations, the indiscriminate impact of the Spanish flu, which in many ways invalidated ideas of social Darwinism among some communities, led to the growing movement towards public health as we recognize it today. And that growing movement then coalesced with the actions that were taken in the Second World War to protect populations so that they could be mobilized to fight that war. And in the UK, we have a particularly pertinent example of that in the case of the National Health Service, where the arguments were being made prior to the Second World War that we could not afford a more sophisticated health service. During the Second World War, an emergency hospital service was inaugurated, breaking those previous taboos, and it led us to finally adopt models of socialized healthcare that were already becoming more apparent across Europe. That wasn't just a big thing for healthcare, that was a big thing for the political economic paradigm. The National Health Service and socialized healthcare sit at the heart of a new systems approach to political economy that was inaugurated as we left the Second World War in the UK and other countries around the world. So overall, it does look like public health crises can have a significant impact upon shifting the paradigm, or at least that we see that in the past. There are, of course, instances where that isn't the case. There has been an enduring major pandemic afflicting the world over the last 30 to 40 years that has killed tens of millions of people and hasn't necessarily led to deeper shifts in political economy, particularly when it comes to the development of countries in the global south. So again, interests, power imbalances, and various efforts to try and win certain ideas based upon the elite interests themselves are major players here, and we will see that playing out in the crisis now. Finally, crisis as a strategy. Here is one of our favorite characters that we've had pop up on the new Paradigm seminars over the years, Milton Friedman, who famously said that it's only crises that lead to significant change, and that certain ideas need to be around to ensure that when the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable, it is our ideas that we want to make change. It does look like, it does feel like that we are in one of those moments now. It has been extraordinary to watch in the UK and other countries around the world, the sacred cows of the existing paradigm be so readily slaughtered by those who are in government. But the general strategy of change through crisis is, I would contend, becoming increasingly imprudent because of the nature of the crises that are coming. We are seeing, particularly when it comes to the interdependency of our systems, the fragility, as Patrick was saying, and then the very nature of the crises that are coming, that we're going to enter an unprecedented period that I would call a new domain of risk. In the main, environmental breakdown, not just climate, but other environmental degradation, is leading to a situation of enduring destabilization, a new extreme normal, as it were, in which our systems will experience saturating, enduring destabilization. There will be crises, more extreme crises, as time goes on. We can't bet on them as being there to make change, because some of those may be serious terminal crises that push us towards new suboptimal equilibria. And others will also exploit those crises. And by their very nature, that exploitation, or the ways that societies could develop, could be regressive as the crises increase and that destabilization increases over time. So the classical idea of change only through crisis is based upon historical, verifiable historical observation of change having come through crisis. As a strategy, it is exceptionally dangerous, and we must be wary to that. And I very much look forward to the discussion we're going to have now about that. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Laurie, for this overview, and especially like the last short film that gave us an impression of what you think we're heading to. Comments are planned for by Maja Göpel and KATHARINA PISTOR. Maja, would you go ahead with your comment on the inputs we just had and your perspective on resilience and the chance for a paradigm shift?
Yeah, if I may, I do have a few slides as well, because I really dug up the term of resilience, so that we are clear on what we're talking about. So I'll put those up. So yeah, I basically just checked out a little bit of what it is that we speak about from a point of view that also has environments. It actually dovetails quite perfectly, Laurie, from what you've been putting out, and also Patrick, what you've been saying. So thank you very much for organizing it in that sequency, because we did not talk about before what we were all going to say. So for me, also the first bit of the seminar was very much affirming what is not really talked about in public, but I've been trying also to ventilate much and more, that this development of the economic system currently is not well predictable. This whole V idea is not what I see happening, at least, and I think it's been very much confirmed throughout the day. But that means that we have to have something like an adaptive management approach for the next months at least, and then to calibrate the state market societal partnerships accordingly. So I was very happy also to see that we have so much disagreement about what monetary policy is allowed to do in there and this and that. So it shows that economics is not a natural law, but it is basically a decision of people that have convictions and ideas. And for me, the thing also that is really, really important when we talk about future resilience and what it is that we want to look at is to understand, and Laurie, you made it very clear in the health system, is that we've been experiencing a wake-up call to what really matters. And I think that should inform the priorities also in what the adaptive management really looks at and puts at the center of prioritization. So health is the obvious one, and then nutrition. And this whole idea that you go to the supermarkets and not everything might be there anymore has been quite frightening for people. And then including, at least in Germany, once you have a travel ban, basically the workforce to take out what you want to eat is not available. So it's become very, very clear how fragile our nutrition system is. And when we look at the international scheme out of Europe, obviously it's much more dire there, that you have appeal not to have export bans because entire nations have become so basically import dependent on their staple goods that we are really looking at having a food crisis very soon. And when we talk about climate change impacts, already we have a massive drought in Germany around Brandenburg, where I live, for example. then obviously we see that people want to have access to energy, and that kind of energy should not be the one that is spurring climate change. And then we've seen that there is a whole social element about housing and having secure access to housing, and the worries about being kicked out now when I can't pay my rent anymore. And it's been a real concern for people before, that they were not able to move even though they had children because rent had gone so up so much. And now, especially ones that are not covered by stimulus packages enough, or by the support packages, sorry, enough, are really concerned about being able to stay where they are. And then we, as we do today, it's not so much social distancing, it's physical distancing that we do. So the possibility to relate and to communicate and to assure each other as a very fundamental element of especially navigating crises. And then the element of income that we talked about, the secure access to all of the above, do depend obviously on having the money to purchase them or having the social relations and networks that are able to provide. And this is why I think it is really important to look at, and we've been talking about a few of the aspects now, how can we make sure that the money is not necessarily going into structures that are on pause, that are basically in a sleeping beauty state right now because they can't sell the produce and thus have stopped production. And we see what happens if you don't stop production and can't sell it, then you've got a negative oil price. So how do we still ensure that people get the kind of solidarity, not only with the sick people, but the ones that are most at risk from having to stay home? So the direct payments to people and the direct payments to have a stable balance sheet to especially small, medium-sized enterprises, for me, were the most important aspects on that social side. And then just to add that this environmental aspect, so that we have 3 areas of sustainability altogether, obviously is that there has been a huge risk perception before the crisis, and so that we have now luckily really taught the populations about flatten the curve and the kind of dynamics that happen in complex systems, and that people do have to understand that this notion of cutting down on CO2 taxes right now, or just going back with fossil fuels, is simply going to have another curve exponentially grow that we said should peak and go down this year, which is peak carbon. And this is why I think some of the suggestions right now to get away out of clear policy signals like the CO2 tax, etc., are absolutely crazy and just up the kind of uncertainty in the economic space and really hamper the pioneers and really hamper those that have taken serious that pre-corona crisis moment and had started to prepare solutions that we will depend on in the future. And now I don't know how to. Oh, here we go. And yeah, just to put that out, I mean, this was January. That's the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report. And we do see that in the multi-stakeholders, we haven't even had the pandemics, but we did have it in the infectious diseases amongst the global shapers. But we do see that the green bits and mass weapons of mass destruction have been on the horizon of what we need to look at. And so for me, the kind of formula right now, what we do in this adaptive management is really to say, how can we get to income and work whilst preserving or improving the provisioning that people really depend on? So how can we use quite a bit of the stimulus, even if we can't up what we are selling right now, people can still work on transforming, for example, supply chains. They can work on resource efficiency, for example. A lot of the research that we've been doing, why people don't go for resource efficiency measures in running their companies was, oh, there's a lack of time and there's lack of knowledge and there's a lack of money. So how can we make sure that the patient capital that's now available and people possibly having to stay home is preparing them to then be able to do the kind of transformations within existing processes of which we say they have to stay, to make them much better once demand is picking up again. So the kind of transformation within existing supply chains is one of the possible ways to look at. But also then to really not ever forget, and I do put this up again and again, just because it's been so hard to really speak about it, that the risk that we're talking about, this is the Maldives that have been speaking at the National Criminal Court, and they were very clear that this is not only an economic issue. So we have to make sure that economics does serve the people and the protection of the basic living conditions for people. And in this case, we're talking about the geographical realm of a territory of countries. And so not to play out money that we can print, and we've been talking a lot about how maybe there isn't even a limit to printing. I don't know much about modern monetary theory, but even if we need to talk about debt and getting debt out, there also have been, when we look at the paradigm you've been talking about, Laurie, there have been debt cancellation summits, etc. in history as well. So how do we avoid irreversible risk-taking or basically shocks to our system? Because COVID is reversible after a time, financial crises are reversible after a time, but getting out of a climate crisis isn't irreversible in the end when we talk about it. And this is why I think looking at what do we mean with resilience is really important when we also trying to understand not only what are the numbers, but also what are the relationships that we might want to look at, because it will stay such a kind of navigation phase, which will be highly political. And so a lot of what we've been talking about in Germany, and Peter said it before, Peter Bofinger, about, no, it was Jakob actually, Jakob Weizsäcker, was this Schicksalsgemeinschaft, so a community of joint fate. And that would require much more list of developments of how resilience has been thought about. So it was very much engineering before, and then ecological observations of how ecosystems are becoming more resilient. There's always a diversity aspect there, a decentralization aspect there, some redundancy, so buffers built in. But towards social resilience, which is at the essence of running economies under high uncertainty, there's a lot of focus on actors and power relations and the possibility of actors to bring forward alternatives and to avoid vulnerabilities. So this adaptation capacity and the emphasis on transformation if is necessary. So being prepared to do things differently and having the courage and the knowledge and the ideas and the networks to do so. And this is why I feel it's good to look at what we talk about when we talk about the resilience, and really look at what's the basis of this. If we're talking about some situations similar to after World War II, luckily we will have the infrastructure in place. It's not going to be bombed out. So it is basically a bit in a sleeping beauty state, which makes it much less scary. So looking at what are the human reserves, I would also really urge us to never forget the link when we look at where did the pandemic come from, to not forget that there's a lot of research looking at planetary health and looking at how zoonotic viruses like this one are jumping from animals onto people when we're destroying the habitats of the animals. But also, I think there's been now abduction results in Germany that there was diabetes, respiratory diseases, obviously much higher in the places where there was a lot of air pollution. So the likability of being a high-risk patient to such viruses is directly linked to the environmental conditions that you're living in and under, including good nutrition, which was one of the aspects with the diabetes and high blood pressure elements, and overweight, obese people having been more likely to die from it. And so what it is that people need right now to also feel like they're capable of not being very scared, but to get out there and try to engage with resolving. And then obviously the planetary reserves are linked to that, the regeneration of reliable and sufficient ecosystem services over time, and their adaptability to changing circumstances. We talk a lot about this in soils, for example, and how do we ensure that growth can still happen of trees and crop, etc., when climate change is changing the quality of the soils, and we have all the droughts that we've been talking about before. So this anticipatory way of looking at things, I hope people have understood much more how important it is, and how important it is that policymakers put in the very clear guiding frameworks for markets and for people's orientation that anticipate before we have a clear visibility of the massive impact, because then the break time is so long that we're going to have a much bigger crisis than when we act on a preventive, in a preventive way. And just to throw out a few opportunities where we could focus on when we look at the formula of job or income plus reshaping systems that were not very resilient, or lose-lose systems, as this is a report from Systemic, that are already documented before to need changing. And you do have the health aspect in there as much as the environmental aspect when they start looking at what is actually the economics of what we have as a nutrition system or the global food and land use system. And this could be in the search, obviously, of who can go out and doesn't have to stay home, but something outside, and farming was the first thing, A, necessary, and B, when you're outside, it's easier actually to do the kind of work than when you're shoved in small rooms. So it could be one of the ones where we can provide stimulus for people to work on really doing agriculture differently and starting to regenerate for payments for ecosystem services, etc. So it would be a huge Green Deal aspect that we can look at in that area. Getting valuation right. I mean, I think we all have seen that this notion of data might have to be corrected against. Actually, it's good if people get healthcare and when people get the kind of food that they deem necessary. Yes, they also want digital connection. So, but yes, what do we look at? I think it was a very, very important comment this morning to also look at is it infrastructure more than anything else, and how should we regulate infrastructure? And especially when we also start thinking about how we might want to generate some income, so not just printing money, but looking at what is the solidarity aspect. We had a lot of uproar in Germany when, for example, the companies now, the auto companies want to get a public payment or bailout and then give out dividends to their shareholders that sit around the world. With big rich companies like Adidas, they wanted to also stop paying their rent, even though they've had massive gains last year. So I think there is a whole new way of looking at what is a solidarity notion also for the performance of companies that we can look at and really make sure that all the beginning of having much better value-based balance sheets that were already in the making. And there's going to be in the Green Deal something about new corporate reporting, financial taxonomy on what it is that we're actually creating, where the money goes. We shouldn't let go of those. And we really should look at how we ensure that this is something people trust in coming so that they're oriented in that direction.
Maja, how many more slides do you have? I just have to make sure we have time for a little discussion afterwards.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's two more I think are interesting when we look at what we might want to use the money for.
Okay, keep it short.
Yeah, it's the kind of business models. When we talk about resilience, we can start in the health sector. I mean, they were run down because of the economic efficiency. So if we talk about business models needing to be more resilient, that means having more people doing the kind of job or having buffers in there. So we do have a different way of looking at productivity. So how do we factor that in the way that stimulus is being put out, and that we also are understanding that this might mean that we're going to measure the outcomes quite differently, or at least the cost-benefit ratios quite differently. So I think there's a whole aspect here that we can recalibrate, looking at what we see emerging that could also help us focus much more on what we're gaining, rather than being so scared at what we're all potentially losing right now. We just have to get the indicators differently. We have to get the attention of what's being created differently. And the economic structure is my last aspect, because I think we've been touching on this before. We have to make sure that not all the pioneers in the small business are now the ones that are falling behind, because we do not want to end up with oligopolies. And when we look at the effects of the Trump stimulus package, I think it's been summarized quite nicely. When we continue that direction, it's just going to be not many actors left. And then it's going to be yet more difficult to say actually taxation of those really big ones should happen, because they're just really trumping in terms of their economic and political power what states can do. I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maja Göpel. And I pass directly on to KATHARINA PISTOR. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So the last comments were, I think, on point, since I'm speaking from the United States. So thank you very much for bringing me in. And I think my first comment would also be that the paradigm shifts that we might or may not see depend very much on the political economy of different systems. And even within those systems, we might see some change and not other. So, you could imagine that the US takes an even more authoritarian turn, and yet in terms of the structures of the economy or the financial system, not much will change. So we can have rather differential effects. I certainly applaud Laurie's point at the very end, saying that we should not build on crisis to hope for change, because crises are by definition unpredictable how they end up. And when colleagues here in the US say we should just have a major crisis and then things will change, and we get this also new Green Deal done, I always remind them that in the 1930s, the US got the New Deal, and Germany got fascism, and which one will be the likely outcome is always difficult to predict. So I don't like to gamble with crisis. Now that we have the crisis, of course, it's an opportunity to think also positively and think how to restructure the economy. But before we go there, let me just say a few words about how I see how our system operates. And as was mentioned before, I look at it from a legal point of view, and I spent some time trying to understand the private legal institutions that constitute our financial systems. And I think what we've seen since the global financial crisis, we actually have seen major regulatory interventions, in part of the kind that Martin Hellwig and others had advocated, to make the banks more resilient. And I think one of the good notes that we should just emphasize here is that the banks, even in the United States, have become actually more resilient. They have much greater buffers to protect themselves from a major economic downturn because they have to just keep more capital, they have to be more careful in their overall structures. But we have also seen the rise of the shadow banking system. And the shadow banking system in particular is organized based on a highly decentralized system that relies on contracts and legal commitments that work only if they are binding. So our entire financial system in general, but with only a few really resilient nodes built into them, which are the banks, but over 50% of our financial system globally now is so-called shadow banking, relies on binding legal commitments made onto an unknown future. We've always known that, right? But we've always been able to deal somehow with an unknown future. Now we know that the future for certain will be less certain than the past was. And we're meeting that point in time of history with a system that is not up to that task, because the system works only if everybody's lives by the commitment. If you take some of the elements of the chain out of the system collapses onto its own. And you can see this right now in the United States. So the government-sponsored entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, have basically told homeowners that under certain conditions they get forbearance, they may not have to pay their mortgages. But they can't just call up a bank and renegotiate their loans. They're basically not paying into a system that is built around securitization and has a long chain of intermediaries, all of which have payment commitments to somebody else, which they can't simply stop. And that system collapses onto its own when you just take a couple of elements out of that. We've known this in 2008, and I think the major impetus for reform that came from the 2008 crisis was to deal with the banks. I think people, regulators, and those involved in the reforms knew that the so-called shadow banking system had to be touched as well, and to some extent the banks were made a little bit more insular from the shadow banking system, but the system has grown and has become even stronger and bigger, and has arguably encompassed many more players. So when you look at the balance sheet of US non-financial corporations and their deep dependence on debt and on short-term debt and on the ability to refinance themselves all the time, then you can see that some of the mechanisms that we've seen in the securitization business outside the non-financial sector have encroached upon that sector as well. So given that, I just want to come back to Patrick Love's earlier point when he said we have to make the system more adaptable and resilient. And that's true, but there's of course a fundamental paradox here, or at least a tension, conflict here between trying to make a system adaptable and making sure that we have credible commitments. That's how private market economies work, right? Is that you make credible commitments into a future that they will be held up. And how to build safety valves into that system so that we can readjust when the time comes is actually not easy. Right, Germany has found a way ad hoc, basically, in the times of the hyperinflation in the 1920s, when hyperinflation was galloping away and debtors were happily playing with undervalued money. Creditors started racing to the courtroom to get something back. And the courts simply said, pacta sunt servanda, we just enforce our contracts. Until at some point, just before we did the currency reform, the Reichsgericht, the Supreme Court, said, actually, we will adjust contracts. If people made contracts under radically different assumptions than what they now see, and they were both were unable to foresee these changes, the courts will adapt. Obviously, you can't do this easily on a one-on-one basis, which is why we see now interventions such as the government-sponsored entities here or other governments elsewhere saying, there's forbearance for paying mortgages, or there are other mechanisms that we put into the system. But I think at a much larger level, we have built a system that is not only rigid because it relies so much on contracts and chain of contracts, but we also have built a system that, of course, is much too levered and relies too much on debt finance, which is it builds on the assumption that somehow in the future we can deal with that either by repaying or by refinancing. and deals excessively with relatively short-term obligations that are made legally binding to make them credible, tradable on global markets, etc. How to get off that kind of system will not be easy, right? My reading of what is happening in the United States in particular is that everybody's trying to make sure that we get back to where we were. I was already puzzled in 2008 when everybody, mostly economists, were saying we have to go back to the same growth trajectory to where we were before the crisis. And clearly the crisis, I thought then, should have been taken as a signal that that's not where we should be, because that's crashed. But we will do this again. And if, Hank Paulson talked about a bazooka in 2008 that the Fed took out here, maybe the government with the TARP as well. Then I recently spoke to Stephen Eisman, who was depicted in the Big Short movie as well, a trader. He shorted the market in 2008, luckily, and made a lot of money on that. He basically called about what the Fed now has done, like an atomic bomb that it threw at the system, right? And the Fed will continue to do that. But let me say one more comment, and that goes back, I think, to some of the comments that Maja made earlier. What is also interesting to watch is what kind of rescue mechanisms work and how they work in different systems, and what kind of rescue mechanisms don't work. So the US has become a state. The Atlantic recently said it's actually a failed state that is unable to reach its people. It's able to reach its banks. That's where the bazookas and atomic bombs work. It's unable to reach small businesses. So it works through the banks. And the banks just already collected $10 billion in fees to process these payments to so-called small businesses, privileging it's their own larger clients and having to privilege under legal rules those with whom they had already a contract because they were subject to know your customer rules. So you have a system that is basically there's nothing like the KfW in Germany, or like a development bank. We have a small business administration system that has been gutted for decades, is unable to reach small business to process these loans. So you're basically reinforcing existing structures to give aids to entities that have never received aid on that scale before, but you have basically a parasitic system that eats part of it and strengthens itself as we go along. So against that background, I don't really see that we will have fundamental change in the United States, because the banks are making themselves indispensable as intermediaries, even if they do a really bad job. But there is just no alternative, and the only truly functioning government agency in this country is the central bank. None of them, the others, are getting even close. So when I instead take a look at the German finance minister webpage and see how the money is channeled, either through agencies within the federal states to really small entities or self-employed, or through the KfW to larger firms. I don't know how it really works in practice, but there's an alternative system in place that this country doesn't have. I'm not sure how many other countries don't have it. I'm wondering about countries like India and others, which brings home the point again that the United States might be closer to failed states that we see elsewhere. Let me just sort of step back a moment again and say, so basically what I'm saying is not only at a national level, also at a global level, we have to reckon with a system that is, as I said in my recent book, it's coded in law, right? And these codes, these private legal codes, are structured such that people live up to their commitments. And we have to really think very hard about how to deal with that in a future that will see more crises, if it's a pandemic or sort of a multitude of crises that are linked to one another. We simply, in law and even in comparative law, I launched a sort of a discussion forum about 2 years ago, where we tried to compare from different countries, what solutions do you have with unforeseen crisis to deal with the legal commitments that we have. We have bankruptcy, case by case. We have, like in Germany, we have this
I have to ask you to come to a close, to leave a little time for discussion.
Okay, so I can wind this up. I'm just saying that we don't have easy legal solutions to deal with that, and I'm not really sure how we build a well-functioning private economy without making credible commitments on the future either.
Thank you very much for very different and very interesting contributions to start a discussion. We have not too much time left. I would start with one of the questions that we have in the questions and answers. Is resilience really a transformative concept? Or is it rather that we should demand for a definancialization? Is the term itself and the concept too small given the need for a huge change in the way we function as a whole system? I put this to Patrick because you raised the resilience concept too, and I'd like to hear your opinion on that. You're still muted. You're muted. Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Resilience is only one aspect of a system I think we have to take into account when we're trying to talk about paradigm shifts and trying to change the paradigm. That said, when you think of the very important systems our daily lives depend on, I'll just take one example, global value chains. That's probably one of the most efficient systems which we have in the world today. Global value chains seem to be, at least, extremely efficient until a crisis happens, like the health crisis. The organizing principle of a global value chain, the business model, if you like, is just in time. What we would argue in terms of resilience is that maybe just in time needs a dose of just in case. It needs the buffers, it needs the redundancy, it needs the capacity so that it doesn't get caught out when something like the coronavirus crisis happens. So I think in some domains, more of resilience would be transformative, but I don't think it's the only thing you have to think about. I think it would be a mistake to put all your eggs in the one basket and say, once we've solved the resilience problem, we've solved the whole systemic problems facing society. It was very rich what Maja, KATHARINA, and Laurie said. I can't react to all of it, but I was struck by a passing reference you made, Maja, to East Germany. That seems to me like a kind of counterexample of a society which was neither finally efficient nor resilient. And we didn't know that. Why did nobody see that coming? And this is constantly the case when crisis and collapse happens. We're caught out because often we're looking at the wrong things. If we take a more recent, like the Arab Spring, who would have predicted that it was going to start in Tunisia? It's not the kind of people we talk to at the OECD, because we look at GDP growth, debt ratios, a whole series of things. Miss the point. We have to look, when I say we have to look systemically, that means we have to look at all the properties of a system. That means looking at the human aspect of a system as well. Josh Epstein, this epidemiologist I mentioned earlier, he said the pandemic is actually two epidemics interacting. There is a medical epidemic and an epidemic of fear. And the way these two interact produce these curious dynamics we see. And there's nothing new about that. It's not just, if you like, the objective facts. Laurie, I think it was interesting, you were looking at all these historical examples. In 1665, the author Daniel Defoe, whom you probably know from Robinson Crusoe, wrote a journal about the plague in London. And he made the point, he said, the plague was great, but the rumor was greater. Often, it's the way people react emotionally to things which causes the system to change. It's not necessarily underlying objective facts of things. Bob Shiller makes this point as well in his work on narrative economics. Narratives are not just ways of describing what happens in the economy. They also change what happens in the economy. So to answer briefly the question, yes, resilience can transform some sectors, but we have to take a much broader view. We have to look, as Katharina said, about interconnectedness. We have to abandon the idea that you can get back to some equilibrium was there before. We have to consider the tipping points, as the East German example showed. We have to revise our indicators to know what we're actually looking at when we, as economists or policy advisors, make policy or give advice. So yes, resilience can be transformative, but it won't transform things on its own.
Martin Helwig mentioned in his comment that some of the advisors, until very recently, recommended cuts in the health system, and that has been part of our discussions this day and yesterday. I come back to Laurie. You mentioned you showed some of the headlines of changes that we can see in the measures taken and the rhetoric taken. Would you say that we can really observe that they aim at a change in paradigmic thinking, or is it just the justification for emergency measures in the sense now we have to do something differently, or is it really looking at in the future we have to change track because we were wrong, which would provide more the way towards a paradigm shift?
I think that's the big question for anyone who is trying to strategize and alter that direction when it comes to mapping who could potentially be allies. A lot of them, I think, the narratives at the moment do cluster in the emergency response bracket of things are extraordinary, and after this, whatever that looks like, they must be put back in the box. I'm sure you discussed that when you're talking about monetary financing earlier. That's definitely the case here in the UK. It was quite something watching Ken Rogoff as well at the beginning of all of this sort of say, yeah, you know, $5 trillion worth of debt, sure, do it, you know, and that must be particularly galling for some people in Europe, in Southern European countries, I would think. But there is already a number, at least here in the UK, a number of people talking about the changes to corporate governance, deeper changes to social contract. It was quite something to see the FT's editorial on the 4th of April talking about the need to have a different social contract. I would look it up if anyone has not done that yet. But all of the, you know, words are very easy and words sell, particularly at this point in time. And it's going to be the actions taken by extraordinarily powerful people in society, groups in society, the behavior of the US economic bazooka, as Katharina was putting it, is far more globally impactful than, at the moment, than many of the conversations to be having about how we should be changing certain paradigms and things like that. So I think it's all still up in the air. I think a lot of people are afraid of being perceived as ambulance chasers in trying to exploit a crisis, if you can put it like that. I think that will increasingly change. And a lot of the actors that we see across the world at the moment aren't necessarily ones who we can automatically bank on as pursuing efforts that come next that are pursuant with a lot of, I assume, the goals and objectives that people were talking about here in this panel and other ones today. And the crucial point I would say about resilience, to back up what Patrick was saying and to go to the exact question that we've got here on the Q&A, yeah, resilience does not have to be a transformative concept. It can be a doubling down concept to ensure that certain measures are taken to protect the system as it is. There is now a race on to dominate the idea of what resilience looks like coming out of this, because it will be on everyone's minds. And one of the lessons in looking back through history at previous crises is that public health, being the thing that has emerged out of crises in the past, pandemics and things like that, fundamentally is about a transformative approach to resilience. So changing systems to ensure that we're making progressive change that also helps for resilience as well. And the emergence of socialized healthcare was for a number of reasons, but fundamentally the public health movement was about not just trying to protect against shocks like pandemics, it was about changing societies fundamentally so that they could bounce back from certain shocks, they could minimize the existence of other ones. And that's why the planetary health approach, which has been talked about on this panel so far, is that fundamentally that's what it's about. It's taking the learnings from what public health has always done, and sometimes hasn't been able to do in penetrating to frontline politics, and connecting that with our understanding of the vulnerabilities of natural systems. Those are the two areas that we need to be learning from when it comes to the kind of narratives we're pushing now as we move from emergency measures to the recovery measures. But, as I said, many of the actors who are in powerful positions to dominate the transition from emergency to what comes next are not those necessarily who are adopting those kind of messages.
This is why I think one important thing, just to add, that's been flagged now by social democrats at least, when we talk about learning from World War II, there has been a thing that was done that's called Lastenausgleich. So after you've come out of the massive crisis, you look at who's been kind of not hampered that much from it, because it is considered as an external shock like the war was. And then it was really about having 50% shaved off of the ones that were the most wealthy and the least hit over a 30-year time span. But at least there was a very clear commitment to have not the distributional effects of this shock be set in stone forever. And what I've been trying to say is that this is the kind of at least message that we need right now, so that people stop feeling so anxious about who's taking advantage of this so far, that we say in the midterm, in whenever it feels more normal again, we're going to look at this Lastenausgleich, so a resharing of the burdens and the benefits from what has been done now, with the notion of being very reactive and having to stabilize a lot of the status quo. Something like this would be part of what I would call a social contract.
There was one comment in the there was one comment in the question and answers, and I come back to you, Katharina, with reference to Japan now trying to have more production in their territory instead of importing from China. And my question is, if the paradigm shift that we might have with this crisis might not be the one that is already taking place with many leaders around the world working towards deglobalization and a reduction of multilateralism, and so that at the end we will be in a world where exactly those structures that we would need to give a good answer to the climate crisis are the first victims of the corona pandemic that we're now in. Katharina, I didn't want to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, just briefly on the former comment, I think one of the big questions is what is actually the unit of analysis when we talk about sharing or Ausgleich and things like that, right? And of course, for the European Union, we've been looking at the debate again and the struggle to do something that is at the European level at least. Clearly, we would need something at the global level right now, but the political economy is such that that's very unlikely to happen. So, and on the point about sort of bringing production back home, we've seen the protectionism of the Trump administration, and they're taking advantage of this. Trump just suspended immigration, probably the first time in the American history, whatever he means by that, we never know that for sure. So I think that could be one of, again, so I think the crisis can go in so many different directions and can be abused also by so many powers. I think what is important about the Japanese move is to make sure that we have, at some levels of production levels, so that if you have to shut down, people have food, right? And so that you have to, and we have to rethink that you can't always buy this on global markets. We learned this in the 2000s when many emerging markets could no longer buy food because it was financialized, so the prices went up through the roofs and they couldn't buy it, but that you simply cannot get it as something relatively new. So I think there will be a new configuration of global trade for sure, but whether this will benefit broader resilience and good things in the long term is just an excuse to do protectionism, we have yet to see.
I would have many more questions to ask. The effect that was mentioned, that there is no equilibrium we will return to, what has that on economic thinking and a paradigm shift there? What is the geographical scope for a Lastenausgleich? Many interesting questions that we would like to continue debating, but this is the end of our session, and I want to respect all of your calendars. Thank you very much. I think we had very important and remarkable interventions here that give us food for further discussion. At the end of this panel, I also want to thank Thomas Fricke and the team of Forum for a New Economy for the organization that we did together of this conference. Thank you for the very good cooperation. There will be a lot of information that we gathered during this conference on the websites, both of the forum and of Transformative Responses, so that we make it available to everyone. And I pass on to Thomas Fricke for a last word of goodbye. Have a good evening, and thank you very much.
Yes, thanks, Gerhard. Just quickly, because it's late and we may have some other things this evening to breathe and get through all these ideas. Just wanted to recall, when we started, we wanted to do a conference on how to prepare for the next crisis. Then we realized that with Corona, we're in the midst of this crisis. And we now realize that maybe this is just postponed. I mean, in a couple of weeks or months, when the worst is over, we may have a lot of reasons to do another workshop on how to prepare for the next crisis, be it for the next wave of Corona or whatever we wanted to talk about. And we did already talk about this today. And I think it's obvious there's many open questions and passionate things to discuss, that there's a lot of potential for this next work. We want to work as Forum New Economy now, especially on a recovery plan that seems obvious, and we want to invite you all to participate and contribute to that. We will have another workshop in probably late September, early October, on the future of the German model, and we will see if we, at that time, will have the opportunity to get back together in person, which may be nice. That being said, I think these, let's say, kind of can you hear me now conferences that we now experience are funny also. I mean, in a way, it's at least the least costly workshop we ever did, at least in monetary terms. Not necessarily in terms of nervousness and stress, because handling all that was not really evident, and it's the first time we did a 1.5 day completely video workshop. That leads me to really thank our team, because I mean, they have been more in the background essentially than at any other workshop, but that has been a huge work. We have been on Twitter, we've been on YouTube, and we needed to coordinate all and everything. And I think everything quite more or less worked. There was just minor problems. So I want to thank Mark, Adam. Maybe you just say a word. Everyone, see you again. He has been visible for his contribution, excellent contribution on helicopter money. I want to thank Tore Beckmann, who's done a lot of our technical work on Twitter, and also contributed a lot to our content discussions. Tore, if you are...
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Tore Beckmann. And Anne Zweinert, who has been working hard the last few days, because she's in that very typical case in these days of someone who has to work and have 2 children at home. And we learned to love both of your children. Very sweet. Also, for evidence, Simon, who has led this workshop together with me, and Markus Wolf from Finanzwende, from your side, together with Gerhard and the team, with your contribution to the workshop. So, I mean, really, you can't clap your hands probably, but
well, this version does work.
Send everyone whatever, and send us any comments, good or bad. I mean, to learn about this and how to do this next time. That would be great. Thanks to Finanzwende, to the Transformative Response to the Crisis, supported by Böll Stiftung, the OECD, and then New Approaches to Economic Challenges unit. I mean, it's perhaps a long list, but it's really from our hearts to thank you all. And let's do our best to fight this crisis and to fight for a better world. So just many thanks and goodbye, for see you next time.